The avoidant builds their entire relationship strategy around managing and controlling the emotional temperature of their partners, using withdrawal and distance as weapons, while depending on others to pursue, understand, and emotionally regulate both themselves and the relationship dynamics. They become masters at navigating emotional storms, deflecting intense feelings, and maintaining power through strategic unavailability, while their partners exhaust themselves trying to bridge gaps that the avoidant deliberately creates and maintains for psychological safety. But there exists one force that can completely dismantle their sophisticated defense system with devastating efficiency: the superempath's decision to stop engaging entirely, to withdraw their emotional labor and attention so completely that the avoidant suddenly finds themselves in a void of silence where their usual manipulation tactics have no target. Their withdrawal strategies have no effect, and their defensive patterns serve no purpose because there's nothing left to defend against. When the super empath, who has spent months or years providing endless emotional support, understanding, and patient pursuit, finally chooses silence over engagement, the avoidant experiences psychological collapse unlike anything their defensive programming was designed to handle. They discover that all their relationship power came from having someone to push away, someone to withhold from, someone to emotionally manage through strategic distance and calculated unavailability. The super empath silence eliminates the avoidant's primary source of emotional regulation, identity validation, and psychological control, leaving them face to face with the emptiness they've spent their adult life avoiding through sophisticated manipulation of others' emotional investment in their well-being. The silence reveals that their independence was actually elaborate dependency disguised as strength. Their self-sufficiency was actually reliance on others' emotional labor disguised as autonomy, and their emotional walls were actually prisons that required someone else's attention to feel meaningful rather than suffocating. The psychology of silent withdrawal. The super empath's transition from emotional availability to complete silence represents a fundamental shift in the psychological landscape that the avoidant has learned to navigate through manipulation, control, and strategic emotional management. This silence operates as the ultimate withdrawal, not the temporary strategic distance that the avoidant employs to maintain power, but the complete cessation of emotional engagement that eliminates their ability to regulate the relationship dynamic through their usual tactics of withholding, testing, and calculated unavailability. Silent withdrawal differs fundamentally from angry confrontation, emotional outbursts, or dramatic exits that the avoidant has learned to handle through defensive strategies and emotional distance. Silence provides no emotional content to deflect, no drama to manage, no pursuit to discourage. It simply removes the avoidant from the center of someone's emotional universe, where they've learned to maintain their sense of importance and psychological security through being the object of another person's care and attention. Understanding the psychology of this withdrawal means recognizing that it represents the super empath's evolution from someone who believed love could heal attachment wounds to someone who understands that healing requires willing participation from the wounded person. The silence doesn't emerge from anger or resentment, but from the peaceful acceptance that continued emotional investment in someone incapable of reciprocity serves no constructive purpose for either person involved. The silence becomes psychologically devastating for the avoidant because it eliminates their role as the pursued party who graciously tolerates someone else's emotional neediness while maintaining their position of superiority through emotional unavailability. When the super empath stops pursuing, stops providing emotional labor, stops investing energy in someone who has consistently demonstrated their inability to appreciate or reciprocate such investment, the avoidant loses their primary source of identity validation. This withdrawal also exposes the avoidant's complete dependency on external emotional regulation. revealing how much their psychological stability depended on someone else's willingness to manage the emotional chaos their defensive strategies consistently created. The super empath's silence forces them to confront their own emotional immaturity and their profound reliance on others to provide the emotional services they cannot provide for themselves. Most significantly, the silent withdrawal represents the super empath's recognition that the avoidance behavior patterns are choices rather than disabilities, preferences rather than incapacities, that could justify continued tolerance of emotional neglect and systematic relationship sabotage. The silence communicates that the super empath has moved beyond hoping for change to accepting reality and choosing self-preservation over continued participation in dysfunctional relationship dynamics. The psychology behind this withdrawal includes the super empath's understanding that words, explanations, and emotional appeals have proven ineffective with someone whose defensive programming interprets all emotional expression as potential threat or manipulation. Silence becomes the only communication that cannot be deflected, twisted, or used against them by someone whose attachment wounds make authentic emotional engagement feel dangerous. The withdrawal often emerges after the super empath recognizes that their emotional generosity has enabled the avoidance dysfunction rather than healing it, that their patience has prolonged suffering rather than resolving it, and that their understanding has been interpreted as weakness rather than strength by someone incapable of appreciating the gift of unconditional love and emotional support. Understanding the psychology reveals why the avoidance usual response strategies prove completely ineffective against silence. They cannot withdraw from someone who is already withdrawn. They cannot create distance from someone who is already left. They cannot punish someone who no longer seeks their approval or fears their rejection. The silence eliminates their psychological ammunition while exposing their complete emotional dependence on the very person they've been systematically pushing away. The silent withdrawal ultimately forces the avoidant to confront their authentic feelings about losing someone who provided essential emotional services while requiring minimal reciprocity, revealing the depth of their attachment to someone they've treated as disposable and the extent of their need for someone they've consistently claimed not to need. When the giver stops giving, the super empath's decision to stop giving emotional energy, attention, and care to the avoidant creates a psychological crisis that exposes the avoidant's complete dependency on external emotional labor, while simultaneously eliminating their access to the very resources they've taken for granted throughout the relationship. This cessation of giving operates like the sudden removal of life support from someone who has forgotten how to breathe on their own, leaving the avoidant gasping for the emotional oxygen they never acknowledged needing. When the giver stops giving, the avoidant discovers that their entire emotional ecosystem depended on someone else's willingness to provide understanding, patience, emotional regulation, and psychological support without requiring reciprocal investment or appreciation. They realize they've been living as emotional parasites, feeding off someone else's generosity while contributing nothing meaningful to their partner's emotional well-being or the relationship's mutual satisfaction and growth. Understanding this dynamic means recognizing that the super empath has served as the avoidant's external emotional processing system, their source of validation and identity confirmation, their provider of psychological stability, and their buffer against the anxiety and emptiness they experience when forced to confront their own internal emotional landscape without external distraction or support. The stopping of giving eliminates the avoidant's primary coping mechanism for managing their attachment wounds and emotional limitations. They can no longer deflect their internal emptiness by focusing on managing someone else's emotional investment in their well-being. When the super empath withdraws their emotional labor, The avoidant must face themselves without the familiar distraction of someone else's care to manage, deflect, or take for granted. This cessation also reveals the profound imbalance that characterized the relationship, where one person provided endless emotional resources while the other consumed those resources without acknowledgement, appreciation, or reciprocal investment in their partner's emotional needs and psychological well-being. The avoidant discovers they've been in a relationship with someone's generosity rather than with the person themselves. Most devastatingly, when the giver stops giving, the avoidant loses their sense of specialness and importance that came from being the recipient of someone's devoted attention and emotional investment. They discover that their identity was built around being chosen, pursued, and cared for by someone who saw value in them despite their emotional limitations and defensive behaviors. The stopping exposes how the avoidant's self-worth depended on external validation from someone whose opinion they consistently dismissed and whose feelings they regularly minimized. When that validation disappears, they confront the emptiness of their own self-concept and their inability to generate internal validation for their worth and lovability as human beings deserving of care and connection. Understanding the cessation reveals why the avoidant often becomes desperate and panicked when the superempath stops giving. They're not just losing a person, but losing their entire emotional support system, their source of identity, validation, and their method for avoiding confrontation with their own attachment wounds and emotional limitations that make authentic intimacy feel impossible. The withdrawal of giving also eliminates the avoidant's ability to maintain their comfortable position as the emotionally superior party who graciously tolerates someone else's neediness and emotional investment. When the superempath stops giving, the avoidant can no longer position themselves as the rational, controlled partner managing an emotional, needy person. Instead, they become the needy one desperately trying to restore access to emotional resources they never acknowledged depending on. The cessation becomes most psychologically damaging when the avoidant realizes that the superempath's giving was a choice rather than a compulsion, generosity rather than neediness, and strength rather than weakness that they exploited for their own emotional regulation and psychological comfort. They discover they've been recipients of grace rather than victims of someone's emotional instability. Most significantly, when the giver stops giving, the avoidant must confront the reality that they never learned to provide for themselves the emotional resources they've been receiving from someone else. They never developed the internal capacity for self-soothing, self-validation, and emotional regulation that healthy adults require for psychological independence and authentic relationship participation. The avoidant's dependency on emotional labor. The avoidant's collapse under the superempath's silence reveals their profound hidden dependency on others to perform the emotional work they cannot or will not do themselves. The processing of feelings, the regulation of anxiety, the management of relationship dynamics, and the maintenance of connection that requires sustained emotional presence and vulnerability. This dependency operates invisibly, disguised as the superempath's choice to provide care rather than the avoidant's desperate need to receive it without reciprocal investment. This emotional labor dependency includes the superempath's role as the avoidant's emotional translator, helping them understand and process feelings they cannot identify or tolerate within themselves. The superempath becomes their external emotional intelligence system, interpreting their moods, needs, and internal states, while providing insight into their own psychological experience that their defensive programming prevents them from accessing through honest self-reflection. Understanding this dependency means recognizing that the avoidant has outsourced their emotional development to someone else, expecting their partner to provide emotional services they've never learned to provide for themselves. They depend on the superempath to bridge emotional gaps, initiate difficult conversations, process relationship conflicts, and maintain the emotional intimacy that they crave but cannot create through their own efforts. The dependency extends to the superempath's function as the avoidance anxiety regulator, providing the calm, stable presence that allows the avoidance nervous system to relax and function without the constant hypervigilance that characterizes their internal state when left to manage their own emotional equilibrium. The superempath becomes their human anxiolytic, reducing their stress through consistent emotional availability. This labor dependency also includes the superempath's role in maintaining relationship continuity and momentum, taking responsibility for planning, communication, conflict resolution, and the ongoing work required to build and sustain intimate connection. The avoidant benefits from relationship intimacy while contributing minimal effort to its creation and maintenance, expecting their partner to carry the emotional burden of partnership. Most significantly, the avoidant depends on the superempath to provide hope, optimism, and forward momentum in the relationship. When their own attachment wounds make them incapable of sustaining a positive vision for a shared future or belief in their capacity for lasting love and authentic connection, the superempath becomes their emotional cheerleader and relationship motivator. The dependency becomes most evident when the superempath withdraws their emotional labor, leaving the avoidant to discover they lack the internal resources necessary for emotional self-regulation, relationship maintenance, and psychological stability that they've been receiving through someone else's generous investment in their well-being without acknowledgement or appreciation. Understanding this dependency reveals why the avoidant's claims of independence and self-sufficiency prove false when tested by the superempath's withdrawal. Their independence was actually sophisticated reliance on others' emotional labor. Their self-sufficiency was actually dependence on external emotional regulation, and their emotional stability was actually a parasitic relationship with someone else's psychological resources. The emotional labor dependency also explains why the avoidant often feels lost and disoriented when the superempath stops providing services they never acknowledged receiving. They must suddenly develop emotional skills they've never practiced, relationship capabilities they've never cultivated, and internal resources they've never been forced to develop because someone else was providing these services invisibly. The dependency includes the superempath's function as the avoidant's emotional memory, holding on to the history of their connection, the significance of shared experiences, and the depth of feelings that the avoidant's defensive programming forces them to minimize or forget. When the superempath withdraws, the avoidant loses their relationship historian and meaning maker. Most devastatingly, the avoidant's dependency on emotional labor reveals their profound need for the very intimacy and connection they've spent the relationship avoiding, exposing the gap between their conscious desires for independence and their unconscious needs for the emotional support, understanding and care that only authentic relationships can provide to people whose attachment wounds make love feel dangerous rather than healing. How silence exposes their emptiness. When the superempath chooses silence, the avoidant's carefully constructed facade crumbles. All those years of projecting emotional superiority gone. The sophisticated defensive strategies they've perfected useless against someone who simply isn't there to defend against. Silence becomes a mirror, reflecting back the vast psychological void where genuine self-knowledge should exist. The emptiness hits differently than any confrontation ever could. Arguments they can deflect. Emotional appeals they can dismiss. But silence forces them into their own company. And that company, they discover, is devastatingly hollow. Without someone else's emotions to manage, regulate, or react against, the avoidant faces a terrifying reality. Their entire identity has been built around their role in other people's emotional experiences. They are the withdrawer, the withholder, the emotionally unavailable one who drives others to pursue and please, remove the pursuer. And who are they? The answer arrives with crushing clarity. Nobody of substance, Years of avoiding their own emotional development have left them psychologically malnourished, while others were learning to sit with difficult feelings, process complex emotions, and develop authentic self-awareness. The avoidant was perfecting the art of emotional bypass. They mastered every technique for avoiding internal exploration, except the one that matters most, actually doing it. Silence strips away their usual distractions, no relationship drama to manage, no emotional crises to navigate, no partner's feelings to deflect or dismiss. Just them alone with themselves, discovering that themselves is surprisingly vacant real estate. The superempath's withdrawal removes their primary source of external validation and identity confirmation. For years, being the object of someone's devoted attention provided proof of their worth, significance, and desirability. Even negative attention served this function. Being the difficult partner still meant being the center of someone's emotional universe. But silence says they're not worth the energy required for anger, not significant enough to fight for, not compelling enough to pursue. They've become emotionally irrelevant to someone who once found them endlessly fascinating. This irrelevance cuts deeper than any rejection because it suggests they were never as important as they believed. The emptiness reveals itself through their inability to find meaning or satisfaction in their own company. Without someone else's emotional chaos to manage, they discover they've never developed the capacity for self-soothing, self-entertainment, or self-reflection that emotionally healthy adults take for granted. They're strangers to themselves. Most devastating is the recognition that their emotional numbness, once a proud symbol of their strength and control, has actually prevented them from developing any authentic depth or substance. They've been living on the emotional surface for so long that they've forgotten there could be anything deeper. This silence forces a reckoning with their profound emotional immaturity. While they've been busy avoiding feelings, others have been developing emotional intelligence, empathy, and the capacity for genuine intimacy. They're psychological children in adult bodies, finally confronted with their arrested development. Their vaunted independence reveals itself as elaborate dependency disguised as strength. Without someone to push away, their autonomy feels less like freedom and more like isolation. Without someone to withhold from, their self-sufficiency feels less like power and more like poverty. The silence exposes the tragic truth. They've spent so much energy avoiding emotional depth that they've created exactly what they feared most. A life devoid of genuine connection, meaning, and the very love they unconsciously crave but systematically destroy. The panic of lost control. Control has been the avoidance religion, their safety blanket, their primary tool for managing the terrifying unpredictability of human relationships. They've spent years perfecting the art of emotional regulation. Not their own emotions, which remain largely unexamined, but the emotional temperature of everyone around them. The superempath silence shatters this illusion of control with devastating efficiency. Panic sets in when they realize their usual levers of influence have been disconnected. Withdrawal becomes meaningless when directed at someone who's already gone. Emotional withholding becomes irrelevant when there's no one seeking what they're withholding. Strategic unavailability becomes pointless when availability is no longer desired or expected. For the first time in their adult lives, they cannot manipulate the relationship dynamic. This realization triggers existential terror in someone whose entire identity has been built around being the one who sets the emotional tone, determines the level of intimacy, and controls the pace of connection through calculated distance and strategic engagement. The loss of control exposes how much of their sense of safety depended on being able to predict and manage others' emotional responses to their behavior. When the superempath stops responding entirely, the avoidant enters uncharted psychological territory where their sophisticated manipulation tactics serve no purpose because there's no target to manipulate. This panic differs from their usual anxiety because it cannot be managed through their familiar coping mechanisms. They cannot create distance from someone who has already distanced themselves. They cannot regain control by withdrawing from someone who is no longer seeking their presence. Their psychological tools have been rendered obsolete by the ultimate power move, complete disengagement. The terror intensifies when they realize they've lost the ability to hurt someone who once cared deeply about their approval and attention. Causing pain had been their nuclear option, their way of reasserting dominance when other control methods failed. But you cannot wound someone who is moved beyond caring about your capacity to inflict emotional damage. They discover that their sense of personal power had been entirely dependent on others' emotional investment in them. Remove that investment, and they're left powerless in ways they never anticipated. Their strength was actually borrowed from others' weakness. Their control was actually parasitic dependence on others' lack of boundaries. The panic includes the devastating recognition that they've trained someone to stop caring about them. Their systematic emotional neglect and strategic withholding have finally achieved their unconscious goal. They've successfully pushed away someone who once found them irresistible. The victory feels hollow because it's also a devastating loss. Most terrifying is the realization that they cannot fix what they've broken through their usual methods. Charm won't work on someone who's immune to their appeal. Manipulation has no effect on someone who's seen through their tactics. Even genuine vulnerability feels meaningless when offered to someone who no longer trusts their capacity for authentic change. The loss of control forces them to confront their emotional helplessness. Without the ability to manage others' responses to them, they must face their own responses to themselves. And those responses, they discover, are largely underdeveloped, immature, and inadequate for managing the complexity of their own psychological experience without external assistance. Their panic reveals the profound dependency that their independence was designed to hide. They need others to react to them, respond to them, pursue them in order to feel real, significant, and alive. The superempath's silence threatens their very sense of existence because it eliminates their primary method for confirming their impact on the world. When they realize they need what they rejected, the crushing irony arrives like a psychological avalanche. When the avoidant finally understands that everything they systematically rejected, emotional availability, vulnerability, consistent care, authentic intimacy, represents exactly what their wounded soul has been craving all along. The super empath's silence creates enough space for this recognition to surface, forcing them to confront the devastating reality that they've been running from their own salvation. Years of defensive programming told them that emotional availability meant weakness. Now, sitting in the deafening silence of abandoned love, they recognize it as strength they never possessed. The super empath's willingness to be vulnerable, to express needs, to ask for reciprocity, all the behaviors they once scorned as needy and pathetic, suddenly reveal themselves as acts of courage they've never attempted. The realization hits in waves, each one more devastating than the last. That consistent care they found suffocating, they're drowning without it. The emotional intimacy they claim to find overwhelming, its absence leaves them feeling completely disconnected from their own humanity. The vulnerability they mocked as weakness, they're dying from emotional starvation caused by their refusal to risk it. They begin to understand that their rejection wasn't based on superior emotional intelligence, but on profound emotional cowardice. While they were busy congratulating themselves on their independence, they were actually afraid of the very experiences that could have healed their deepest wounds and provided the connection they unconsciously craved, but systematically destroyed. The super empath's silence forces them to acknowledge that their partner had been offering them exactly what they needed, but were too terrified to accept. Every expression of love they dismissed. Every moment of vulnerability they deflected. Every attempt at deeper connection they sabotaged. All of it had been medicine for wounds they pretended didn't exist. Most painfully, they recognized that their rejection came from fear rather than preference. They didn't actually dislike emotional availability. They were terrified of needing it. They didn't genuinely find intimacy overwhelming. They were overwhelmed by their own capacity to crave it. Their sophisticated defensive strategies weren't protecting their authentic desires, but preventing them from experiencing what they actually wanted most. The recognition extends to their understanding of the superempath's motivations. What they interpreted as neediness was actually generosity. What they saw as emotional instability was actually emotional courage. What they dismissed as weakness was actually the kind of strength that creates genuine healing and authentic connection between two people willing to risk vulnerability. They realized they've been offered a gift they were too damaged to receive, love. They were too afraid to accept, and healing they were too defended to allow. The super empath's silence isn't punishment. It's the natural consequence of consistently rejecting what was freely offered with patience, understanding, and hope for eventual reciprocity. The need they're finally acknowledging isn't new. It's been there all along, buried beneath layers of defensive programming and attachment trauma. The super empath's love didn't create this need. It simply offered to fulfill it. Their rejection of that offer left the need intact, but eliminated the possibility of its satisfaction. Understanding what they've rejected forces them to confront the tragic waste of their defensive choices. They had access to exactly what their attachment wounds required for healing, but their fears prevented them from accepting the very medicine that could have transformed their capacity for love and genuine human connection. The silence makes them face the ultimate irony. They need someone who no longer needs them. They crave the emotional availability of someone who has learned to be emotionally unavailable to them. They want the vulnerability from someone who has learned that vulnerability with them is dangerous and unrewarded. Most devastating is the recognition that their need is now irrelevant. Even if they could somehow communicate their newfound understanding, their realization comes too late to matter. The super empath has moved beyond needing their acknowledgement, their reciprocity, or their love. They're finally ready to receive what is no longer being offered. The silent treatment as ultimate power, the super empath's silence wields more devastating power than any argument, manipulation, or emotional weapon in the avoidance arsenal, because it cannot be deflected, countered, or defended against using their sophisticated repertoire of relationship control tactics. Unlike dramatic confrontations or emotional appeals that provide something to react against, silence offers nothing. And in that nothingness lies its ultimate strength. Traditional power dynamics in avoidant relationships depend on emotional reactivity. The avoidant withdraws, the partner pursues. The avoidant withholds, the partner pleads. The avoidant creates crisis. The partner works to resolve it, but silence breaks this cycle completely, leaving the avoidant shadowboxing with air, trying to manipulate someone who is no longer present to be manipulated. The power of silence operates through its complete indifference to the avoidant's emotional state, behavior, or attempts to regain control over the relationship dynamic. It doesn't matter if they become charming, cruel, vulnerable, or distant. Silence responds to nothing because it represents the absence of engagement rather than a strategy within engagement. This indifference becomes more crushing than hatred because hatred still indicates emotional investment. Anger still suggests caring, and even contempt implies that someone's behavior matters enough to generate a response. Silence suggests complete irrelevance, that the avoidance, choices, feelings, and actions have become so unimportant that they don't merit even negative attention. The ultimate power lies in silence's demonstration that the super empath has found something better than trying to love someone incapable of reciprocity. They've discovered peace in disconnection, relief in absence, and satisfaction in sources that don't include the avoidant. This discovery eliminates the avoidant's primary source of power, being needed, wanted, or emotionally significant to someone who once organized their entire world around securing their attention. Silence also reveals that the superempath's previous emotional investment was a choice rather than a compulsion, strength rather than weakness, and generosity rather than need. The avoidant discovers they were recipients of grace rather than victims of someone's emotional instability, making their rejection of that grace feel even more foolish and wasteful. The power operates through its complete immunity to the avoidant's usual countermeasures. They cannot punish silence with withdrawal because withdrawal from silence is meaningless. They cannot manipulate silence with charm because charm requires an audience to appreciate it. They cannot break silence with cruelty because cruelty has no impact on someone who has moved beyond caring about their capacity for emotional damage. Most devastatingly, silence forces the avoidant to confront their own emotional poverty without the distraction of someone else's emotional richness to manage, deflect, or take for granted. They must face themselves without the usual buffer of relationship drama, emotional crisis, or the familiar dynamic of being pursued by someone they can push away when intimacy becomes threatening. The silent treatment's ultimate power lies in its finality. It suggests that the superempath has moved beyond hoping for change, beyond trying to heal what cannot be healed, beyond investing energy in someone who has consistently demonstrated their inability to appreciate or reciprocate emotional generosity and authentic care. Understanding this power reveals why the avoidant often becomes most desperate when faced with genuine indifference rather than emotional intensity. They know how to handle anger, can navigate conflict, and can manage emotional chaos. But silence represents a level of emotional sophistication and boundary setting that their defensive programming was never designed to counter. The power also operates through its complete lack of drama or theatricality. The superempath doesn't storm out, doesn't deliver cutting final words, doesn't create scenes that the avoidant can interpret as emotional instability. They simply stop. This quiet dignity makes their departure feel more significant and permanent than any dramatic exit could achieve. Silence becomes the ultimate power because it represents something the avoidant has never encountered, someone who has genuinely stopped caring about their approval, stopped hoping for their reciprocity, and stopped investing energy in someone who has proven incapable of appreciating what was freely offered with patience, understanding, and hope.